The title of this story is Noisy Nancy Norris by Luann Gaddert, illustrated by Gioia Fiamenci. Nancy Norris was a very noisy child. She liked to ride her stick horse and pound the end of it on the floor. Nancy liked to clomp down the hall in her mother's high-heeled shoes. She liked to sit on the radiator cover and bang her feet. She even thumped her clay so that the table jumped. Sometimes she banged her doll buggy into the walls. Her pretend games were always noisy. When she was a garbage man, she banged 2 big pans together, making almost as much noise as a real garbage man. When she was a fireman, she made a noise that sounded like a siren. When she was an elephant, she made great clattering feet out of her mother's cake pans. And, of course, she sang and talked most of the day. Sometimes, when Nancy had been talking a long time, her mother would say, in a voice louder than Mother usually used, "Please, please be quiet so I can think." Nancy tried to be quiet, but it was very difficult. Nancy lived in an apartment house, and her noises often disturbed the neighbors. Her friend Sally lived on the floor above, and Nancy used to go to the stairway and call up to her, but Nancy's mother put a stop to that. Mrs. Muffle, who owned the whole building, lived in the apartment just below the Norrises. When Nancy hopped down the hall like a kangaroo, the chandelier in Mrs. Muffle's hall tinkled. When Nancy jumped off her bed, there was a thud over Mrs. Muffle's head. On days when Nancy was especially noisy, Mrs. Muffle would get a broom and bang on her ceiling so that Nancy would hear the bang on her floor. Nancy thought that was very funny. She would get a block and bang back. But Nancy's mother would be cross. "You are disturbing poor Mrs. Muffle," she would say. "Why don't you finger paint?" But Nancy even made a crackle slush sound with the paints and paper. Then came the bad day. It was raining when Nancy woke up, and she felt cross, so she sang, "Bad morning to you, bad morning to you." But she didn't really sing. She shouted. Then she stood on her bed and jumped to the floor. While she was getting dressed, she dropped her shoes one after the other. She slammed the door 5 times. She rattled a stick against the wall as she ran down the hall to the kitchen, and she scraped her chair out from under the table and knocked it over. While she was eating breakfast, she tapped her spoon on her plate until her father asked her to stop. After breakfast, she picked up a wastebasket and drummed on it while she sang and marched through the living room. She was still marching when the doorbell rang. Nancy rushed to the door, and there was Mrs. Muffle. "Where are your parents?" she demanded. Mother and Daddy said, "Good morning," and "How are you?" and all of the polite things that grown-ups say. Mrs. Muffle didn't answer them. She just glared at Nancy and said, quietly of course, "I've had all the noise I can take. You will have to move unless I have complete peace and quiet from now on." She walked out without saying goodbye. Nancy and her mother and Daddy sat staring at the door, which closed quietly behind Mrs. Muffle. "Oh, my," moaned Mother. "Did you hear what she said?" asked Daddy. "I know it will be difficult, Nancy, but you must be quiet or we will have to move, away from your friends and your playground, maybe even out of the city." Nancy nodded and tiptoed to her room and sat on the bed. She was still sitting there, thinking and doing nothing, when Daddy came to kiss her goodbye before he went to his office. Nancy just said, "Goodbye," very softly. Then Mother came to tell her that she was going out and that Grandma would stay with her. Grandma came and Mother went. "Come out to the living room and talk with me, Nancy," Grandma called. Nancy went. "How are you, dear?" asked Grandma. "Fine," she whispered. "Did you go to the playground yesterday?" "Yes," said Nancy. "What did you do?" "Played," said Nancy. "Is something the matter?" asked Grandma. "You seem very quiet." "No," said Nancy. Grandma read her a story, and then Nancy went to her room and looked at picture books. When Nancy's mother came home, Grandma told her that there was something wrong with Nancy. "I have been here for 2 hours, and she hasn't said more than a few words. She hasn't jumped. She hasn't run." As soon as Grandma went home, Mother took Nancy's temperature. "No fever," she said. "Do you feel sick?" Nancy shook her head. She was quiet all day. She played with her puzzles, but she didn't even click the pieces. She played elephant, but she pretended to be walking silently on long green grass. She undressed all her dolls and wrapped them in blankets and put them to bed. When Daddy came home, she started to run down the hall to greet him. Then she remembered and tiptoed the rest of the way. When it was time for dinner, she pulled her chair out quietly. "What have you been doing today?" Daddy asked. "Playing," said Nancy. "Did you have fun?" Nancy nodded. She shrugged her shoulders. Then Mother and Daddy started talking to each other while Nancy ate everything on her plate. "My, but you finished quickly," said Daddy to Nancy. "That's because she hasn't been talking," said Mother. Nancy went to bed quietly. Of course, she slept quietly. When she woke in the morning, she started to sing, "Good morn," but she remembered Mrs. Muffle's visit, and she didn't finish. Later in the morning, Nancy and her mother went to the playground. Sally was climbing on the monkey bars. "Hi, Nancy," she shouted. Nancy just waved to her and snuggled closer to her mother. She watched Michael and John playing on the slide. "Go play with them," said Mother, "and make noise. This is the place for it." Nancy thought a minute, smiled, and made a great "rrrr" noise and ran toward the slide. She climbed to the top, clanged her feet, and slid down, bumping into John, who was sitting on the bottom. When Nancy rode on the back of Michael's trike, they pretended it was a fire engine. Nancy made her best siren noises. Then they played garbage man, making loud clatters with their sand pails. Nancy made noise all morning, and she talked to her mother all the way home. But the minute they entered their apartment house door, she stopped talking, and she didn't say a word in the elevator, or as they walked down the hall to their door. Right in front of their door was a box with an envelope on top with Nancy's name on it. Nancy opened the box. It was filled with cookies. Mother read the letter to Nancy. "Dear Nancy, my, but it has been quiet down here. Almost too quiet. I hope you're not sick. Please make just a little noise so I'll know you are all right. Sincerely, Mrs. Muffle." Nancy smiled. Then she began to laugh. It would be so much easier to make a little noise than to make no noise at all. She picked up her stick horse and galloped to her room, remembering not to bang the end of the stick on the floor.